Welcome to Common Ground with Bill Walton, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
I'm here today with George Gilder, my friend and founder of Discovery Institute. George is the author of many, many books, one of the leading thinkers of our era. His influential books include Wealth and Poverty, Knowledge and Power, and Scandal of Money. He also wrote a very important book called Life After Television, which predicted the internet and also the smartphone. George is also a man who won the national champion hill racing event a few years ago, although he said it was for over 70. I'm not sure. I think you probably were a runner, have been a runner for a long time. Welcome, George.
Well, great to be here, Bill, as always.
Well, there's so many things we want to talk about. One of the things that's in the news right now, much on people's mind, is tax policy and the Republicans' plan. And you're a longtime observer of the tax scene and policy. What do you think about where we are and what's good about it and what's bad about it?
Well, I think it's just maddening that both parties had just this obsession with paying for tax cuts. As soon as you agree that you got to pay for tax cuts, you deny that you need them. And you confess that tax cutting is a matter of taking something from one tax group and giving it to another group of taxpayers. It's a zero-sum game. The fact is that that all tax rate reductions yield more revenue. That's why you do them. They spur economic growth and opportunity for everybody, and thus they yield just vastly more revenues in the long run than high tax rates do.
So you keep the cash in the productive private sector instead of the dead hand of the government
that's
sector.
That's true. You join knowledge with power.
Now, you made that point in your book. I thought was interesting. Is that capital needs to be in the hands which best understand what to do with it.
That's right.
And so the tax regime ought to be able to leave capital with those who know how to create more capital, innovation, and change.
Who've already proven by previous experience of successful investment that they can expand wealth. I make the somewhat controversial assertion that a capitalist economy is not an incentive system chiefly. It's not a matter of carrots and sticks luring people to do good things, to avoid punishment, and to gain various goodies.
Well, you just described the tax code.
Yeah, that's right. It's not an incentive system. It's an information system, and it's and the reason Mark Zuckerberg is worth $50 billion or whatever it is not that he needed $50 billion to incentivize his activities at Facebook,
right,
but because this money is invested in Facebook and it's governed by the knowledge that he has to expand it and thus open new opportunities. Incentive has nothing to do with it, really. All economies, of course, have incentive structures incorporated in them. But what makes capitalism special is that it's a knowledge and an information system. And wealth is knowledge. That's what wealth is. Wealth is knowledge.
I totally agree. How have you thought about how you'd build a tax system to reflect the fact it's a knowledge-driven system rather than an incentive-driven system?
You don't want to. You don't want to. You want the price signals issued by the tax system to guide correct entrepreneurial decisions that increase wealth, jobs, and opportunities for everyone. And the best tax system is the one that least distorts investment decisions.
So instead of giving credits for solar,
the best tax is a flat tax.
Right.
And And the closer we get to a flat tax, the more revenues we'll get, the more knowledge will be generated, and thus the more opportunities will be open to everybody.
Well, but-
and that's why you want to cut tax rates. But if you say you got to pay for the tax rates, you're implying that cutting tax rates costs the economy something, and it doesn't. Cutting tax rates does not cost the economy anything. It's not. It expands knowledge and spurs growth.
I have an
and-
idea about
and
how you
opens
could
opportunity.
bring in pay for the tax cuts. You could cut spending.
Well, I don't want to even.
You don't even think about that.
It has nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
Spending, you got to make the spending decisions, the best spending decisions you can make, and that's and obviously you don't want to waste resources and spending. So you want to have the optimal spending program, but it has nothing to do with the tax program, with the optimal tax program. Nothing. The tax program is you want to optimize and to yield the most growth and the most revenues,
Well,
and a lot lower rates than we have today.
Well, by those standards, this tax cut we're talking about in the fall of 2017 is pretty small ball. I mean, in fact, we raised the taxes on wealthy individuals, and we narrow the tax base, and we add in more stuff like the child credit and family credit, and there's a lot more junk and complexity tossed in there. So by that standard, this tax plan gets an F from George Gilder.
I mean, the only thing it's doing,
okay to give low grades. We're not a university where everybody gets an A.
The only purpose of it is to cut the corporate rate. The corporate rate currently keeps several trillion dollars of profits overseas. I mean, we have one of the highest corporate rates in the world, if not the highest corporate rate of major economies.
The plan is good on that.
So
it takes us from 35% to 20%.
Well, that will bring back trillions of dollars from overseas if we do it. So it will have a large impact on the U.S. economy.
What's your view? What's your view about? I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but what's your view about where that $3 trillion, maybe some people think more, that's offshore when it gets brought back in? What happens to that?
It's held by companies like Google and Apple, and it will be reinvested in various ways in the U.S. economy. It will become part of the capital structure of the U.S. economy. It will, and if it's accompanied by deregulation and other urgently needed plans, we may have 5G, for example, which is this amazing transformation of wireless networks that's being planned today, but which is in jeopardy because the regulations of telecom are so oppressive that they've lowered the market values, market caps of infrastructure companies to the point that they won't probably be able to raise the $300 billion that's going to take to create 5G, which is a wireless internet infrastructure that runs at 20 gigabits a second. That's 20 billion bits a second. That's about 1,000 times faster than the average broadband
That would be tremendous.
connection.
So then your prediction is that $2 or $3 trillion can go towards building a 5G system?
Yeah.
Well, that'd be very good. What do you think about the immediate expensing provision of it, where you can buy capital equipment and write it all off without depreciation?
That's fine. I mean, I don't.
I think
in general, you see, the corporate rates are so high that nobody can afford to really be profitable. So you get a company like Amazon that is immensely profitable intrinsically, but confesses no profits. Because of and what this means is these big companies get steadily bigger. the stock market shrinks. The stock market is only half the size it was 15 years ago.
We have half as many public companies.
Half as many public companies.
Like 10,000 down to 5,000.
Yeah. And the SEC regulated, which his assignment is to regulate IPOs, and the SEC has extinguished IPOs essentially for technology companies. So the big technology companies buy up their rivals and invest $30 billion a month in their own shares, and thus steadily shrinking the stock market.
Well, I'm a little.
We don't have a stock market boom. We have a shrinking.
That's where I'm a little worried about that. Those $1 trillion coming back in, they might just use it to buy their own stock, which is not going to be the stimulus that we really want.
Yeah.
The other thing about the corporate tax issue is that we've tried to recognize, or they've tried to recognize in the plan, the fact that most businesses are not corporations; they're pass-throughs, they're partnerships or S corps, and they've tried to bring the tax rate down for those, but then they've excluded enormous numbers of industries to try to not cause Wall Street lawyers to declare themselves an S corp and pay lower taxes. And so it's going to be a mess when they try to figure out how to really tax these pass-throughs. And it begs the question, and I'm getting a long question, why do we even have a corporate tax? Why don't we just pay taxes as individuals and have all corporations be a pass-through?
Well, the obvious reason is everybody's afraid to cut taxes for the rich. So therefore, you create this corporate veil that allows you to have a tax system without constant concerns with who benefits, who loses. And as soon as you get in that game, you've gone. It's gone. The economy loses because if tax cuts aren't good for the economy, you shouldn't cut them. And so if you say, if I cut tax rates, I got to pay for them some other way. Yeah. You confess that the tax cuts are bad for the economy. That's what you're saying, and so you're really an opponent of tax cuts if you say you have to pay for them.
Well, I'm in violent agreement with you. This is smart. Let's talk about your book, Life After Google. This is the next one coming up, and from a man who predicted the internet and the smartphone and so many other things. What is life after Google?
I was young back then.
I think you're still pretty young. But what's the book about, and where are we with the publication? I really want to know what it's about. I've got a sense of it.
It's the existing architecture of the internet's bankrupt. It can't preserve anybody's personal information. It can't keep a credit card number secret. It can't interoperate between the different walled gardens, Apple's walled garden, Google's walled garden, Facebook's walled garden, the Chinese Communist government's walled garden, the Iranian mullah's walled garden. It's all a set of balkanized fragments.
So for those of us that don't understand that, I've got a sense of it, but the architecture of the internet is today, could you do a quick summary of what that looks like, where we've got servers
the current architecture is called cloud computing.
Okay.
And it consists of these gigantic data centers with huge air conditioning equipment on their roofs to bear off the heat, implanted by hydroelectric dams and near glaciers to cool them off, and near great rivers. And I think this cloud computing regime, which has been lasted for 10 years or 12, 13 years now, is obsolete. That we're moving toward dispersing the clouds and opening to sky computing on the blockchain, which is a major development in the industry. It's the most important breakthrough in the last since the internet itself.
You sent me scurrying to the internet to figure out what blockchain is, and I've got an article here titled "What is Blockchain Technology? A Step-by-Step Guide for Beginners." Could you
Well,
give us a-
I think the key thing is that it's a new security model that ends this crazy scheme where hundreds of millions of credit card numbers and social security numbers and mothers' maiden names and favorite dogs and beloved songs and are all constantly spewed across the world. And if you can't have security, you can't really have transactions.
You wrote a brilliant summary of this draft in your introduction to the book. I've had a chance to take a look at it. It says, before you read this book, please submit your username and password. We're concerned with your identity, cyber safety, and literary preferences. We want to serve you better. Please transcribe the tangle of case-sensitive CAPTCHA letters in a box to prove that unlike some 30% of web addresses, you are not a bot. Sorry, your username and password does not match our records. Do you need help? If you wish to change your username, your password, or your security questions, please click on the URL we supplied on and on. And this goes on for a couple pages. It's like my life, my wife Sarah is not really a computer person. I say it's really great, and then she gets onto it. And she says, "What
and
are
now
all
they
these,
want your fingerprint and your face too."
Yeah.
And
I can't wait.
And so the
So how does blockchain improve that?
blockchain it takes all that out of the transaction. So it changes the transaction to essentially a cash transaction, which is recorded in a ledger, which is published all across the internet, rather than having the record of transactions all encrypted and put in some data center where a hacker can gain access to millions of personal data points. Instead, you put the essentials of the transaction in a ledger, and then you publish it all around the internet. So all the nodes on the blockchain network all have this ledger. So you can't change anything or steal anything or copy anything without attacking all the nodes on the network.
And this is the technology that Bitcoin is built on.
Bitcoin pioneered this technology, and now it's been expanded to new applications like Ethereum, which is actually solved the IPO problem. Ethereum has conducted over 1,000 ICOs, that's initial coin offerings or crypto asset offerings or whatever.
So these are for companies that don't go public, but they instead raise money through the Bitcoin
they've
exchange?
raised some $2.5 billion in the last 6 months, thousands of these companies, and they're pre-selling their various goods and services. And so they are not equity distributions, they are token issues that give the purchasers of these tokens the right to buy goods and services from the company when those goods and services have been created and developed. And that was all made possible by the blockchain.
So this is like a pre-selling revenue model where you're basically buying the right to buy something in the future?
That's right. But however, there have all sorts of devices been created that make it possible to convert one token into another token. There are thousands of them, so that the tokens become increasingly liquid. So you.
Who's behind this? There was somebody you mentioned,
the new Bill Gates of this. There are two people behind it, chiefly. One is called Satoshi, who is probably a crazy Australian named Craig Wright, and he invented Bitcoin. And then Vitalik Buterin, Peter Thiel lured out of college
Peter
to
Thiel, the
start
venture
a company.
capitalist who founded PayPal.
Yeah. Peter Thiel gives Thiel fellowships to people who are willing to leave the universities behind and start companies. He thinks the universities are the new great sort of oppressive cathedrals of the new era, and they should be.
That sounds about right.
The best students should be indoctrination centers, and Vitalik Buterin was a Russian who came to Canada, got lured out of Waterloo University in Canada, and violated all the principles of venture capital because he's making 5 changes at once. And venture capitalists, as you know, don't like companies that make more than one major change in an industry.
Right.
Well, Vitalik was too young to know these rules, so he was 17 when he started. And he invented a new blockchain. He invented a new computer platform to implement what he calls smart contracts. And he invented, which are contracts implemented in software.
Yeah.
He invented a software language called Solidum to actually implement the smart contracts. And then he invented a currency called Ether to pay for them. And then he invented a valuation metric called gas, which is compute cycles, to establish a metric for valuation. So he made 5 inventions at once. He launched them, and the result has been 1,000 companies have taken advantage of this new platform. 1,000 new innovative companies
And his platform is
have raised
called Ethereum?
Ethereum.
Yeah.
And they've raised $2.5 billion, almost $2.5 billion so far.
Is Ethereum a public company, or is it?
No, Ethereum is a foundation, but
it's a nonprofit.
Ether,
Okay.
but Ether,
Yeah.
the currency is a currency that can be acquired, purchased. It's a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. Ethereum is about half as valuable at the moment as Bitcoin is.
He's written that blockchain solves the problem of manipulation. When I speak about it in the West, people say they trust Google, Facebook, or their banks, but the rest of the world doesn't trust organizations and corporations that much, and he means Africa, India, East Europe, or Russia. It's not about the places where people are really rich. Blockchain's opportunities are the highest in countries that haven't reached that level yet. Now, he says that people trust Google and Facebook. I think that's becoming less so in America. I mean, what does this do for the business models of the giants, Facebook, Google, Amazon?
It really, one of the first successful ICOs was conducted by Brendan Eich, who was the founder of Mozilla and one of the founders of Netscape, and who wrote the JavaScript software language, which is the most widely used software language in the world today. So Brendan Eich launched the first ICO, one of the first ICOs, and raised $36 million in a few hours, and invented a new browser called the Brave browser, which you all can download. And the Brave browser takes back your attention. So you can it makes Google or Facebook or any company that wants to advertise to you has to pay you. And
Well, I like
they
that a
pay
lot.
you in micropayments.
Yeah.
And they're BAM tokens, basic BATs, actually, basic attention tokens. And so it turns the tables on the big companies and makes them pay for your attention rather than tricking you into watching ads in exchange for a search or or a video.
What are the barriers for this gaining widespread use?
What are the?
How is this going to roll out? I mean, this sounds
It
like
is rolling out. It's rolled out now. You can, the Brave browser has been released, but it's one of hundreds of companies that are making this kind of change. All of them restore, rather than the internet today is a giant copying machine. Everything gets copied endlessly. So actual identities and property rights are necessarily slippery because anything can be copied. What the blockchain does is put your identity in an immutable database that you control, so that you divulge any part of your identity only to the extent that you want to, in order to facilitate some transaction or to gain some web publication or whatever you want. But you regain control of your identity. Google doesn't control your identity, you control your identity. And that's the revolution that Valer Buterin's doing, a company I would call Blockstack is doing, that Brendan Eich and Brave, the Brave browser, is doing.
So is Google trying to buy these companies now?
I
bet
they
are.
Google is perplexed.
Yeah.
They have not.
I
They
bet,
are
I bet the
almost.
investment bankers are lining
they're-
up at their doorstep saying,
yeah.
let us buy you. Because
They're-
this is going to be very disruptive.
It is tremendously disruptive, and it's already has tremendous momentum. And Bitcoin has become a kind of new gold. It's a new global currency.
So this since I'm with the world's leading futurists, this means that we could end up with a new version of a gold standard, which a lot of people think is the best standard for money.
Yep.
We deal with cybersecurity. We deal with the hassles of being on the internet with all the personal information that
That's
you've
right.
got to deal with, and we change the business model.
That's
of the
right.
internet, where all of a sudden I've got to get paid for letting you show me your
And it moves the rewards from people who manipulate apps on the edge of the network and bring them back to the providers of the actual infrastructure and protocols and basic infrastructure that makes it possible for the internet to exist. And today, a company like Google has 8 times its revenues and market cap. Apple and Facebook, they have 20 times their revenues and market cap. And the companies that actually build the network, which all these companies depend on, have 1.5 times revenues. In other words, what a tenth or less of the market cap per dollar of revenues. And this is why I worry that 5G, which is the new wireless internet that all the infrastructure companies are committed to build, all the carriers, and won't get built because it's going to cost some $300 billion. And
it's expensive for them to raise capital, whereas for the other companies, it's virtually free money.
That's right.
So,
I sort of hope that if the corporate tax rate can be very substantially reduced,
this will help make that
a lot
happen.
of this money will come back, and it will make its way into the huge opportunities in 5G. Otherwise, 5G is going to be a Chinese technology or
So if Ethereum and the related technologies take off, what's the world look like in 5 years?
well, I think it's going to take. It's happened a lot faster than I expected already, but it's going to redistribute power rather than having the internet being dominated by 3 companies, essentially, a TriNet,
Right.
as Andre Staltz.
TriNet?
TriNet.
Okay.
It's Facebook, Amazon, and Google
yeah,
essentially.
yeah.
Each have their walled gardens, as they call them, where they serve their capture and serve their own customers. And
Sort of a
we'll go
Hotel
back.
California. You can check in, but you can never leave.
Right. Hotel California. That's
I want to change gears to talk about something. You're in town. You're inside the Beltway as we speak, and we want to talk about why you're here. And to do that, I'd like to introduce another guest. I'd like to introduce Hans Haney, who's a senior fellow at Discovery Institute and is responsible for technology policy. And you all are here today to talk about some changes in the FCC regimes. And welcome, Hans, and want to give us a snapshot of what you're here for and what we can expect.
Thanks a lot. It's great to see you again.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Well, George and I have been at the Federal Communications Commission. Back in 1996, Congress delegated some authority to the FCC to change its media ownership rules. And for example, it is currently illegal for a newspaper and a broadcast station to be jointly owned in the same market. Well, in the past decade, newspaper revenues have declined by more than half, from $49 billion down to about $18 billion. And newspapers have cut costs by shrinking their newsrooms. The purpose of this rule initially was to prevent consolidation and promote viewpoint diversity. Well, now we have a situation, a prominent senator this week has proposed to regulate companies like Google and Facebook as public utilities in order to prevent hateful speech, propaganda during our elections, and fake news. I would argue that these are, all of these phenomena are evidence of more viewpoint diversity than we've ever had before. Now really the urgent challenge is to protect journalism, local journalism.
Right.
We call that localism. Clearing away this rule would enable broadcasters and publishers to cooperate with one another, to jointly invest together in conducting investigative journalism, for example, and using the results of that investigation on multiple platforms, in print, on the internet, over the air. The fact is, the rule that we have now it dates back to 1975, before we have the internet. With Facebook today, with Twitter, with blogs, with podcasts, you name it, there are more opportunities to share our personal opinions than there have ever been in the past. And so the FCC has the authority to do this. It could happen as early as next week. There are 5 members of the FCC, 3 of them are Republican. This proposal that I'm talking about was offered by Chairman Ajit Pai, who deserves enormous credit. This is very controversial, and it shouldn't be. The opposition is ideologically driven. So we were at the FCC to promote the efforts of those commissioners.
So this would allow larger companies to invest in local media properties. And I know a little bit about this. I'm a small investor in our newspaper in Rappahannock County, Virginia. So I'm a minor media mogul myself. And it's an extremely expensive process to develop local news. I mean, there's feet in the ground. It doesn't scale very well. So how do you scale local news? How does being owned by somebody bigger help local news stay in business, or holding media properties? Are there technologies or techniques that would help these local papers?
Well, an investment.
I didn't frame the question very well, but it's
Well, no,
figure
it's a good question.
Yeah.
I think the point here is that going forward, once this rule is cleared away, an investment that is made in local news gathering is an investment that will have a higher return, because that news can be shared on multiple platforms.
Mm-hmm. And you could, I can read my local Berkshire Eagle when I'm in San Francisco because it's on the net.
Yeah.
I mean, potentially the internet can expand and is expanding the reach and exposure of local news, and thus potentially the yield of local news. The reason the yield isn't rising is because of this very suboptimal aggregate and advertise regime that tries to feed the pigeons by feeding the horses. which is
Not a very straightforward way to get fed.
which is Google. You pay Google, and Google shows your
Yeah.
item, and you may get some portion of the advertising revenue, but nobody wants to see the advertising. It's value subtracted advertising in general. So it doesn't pay very well. So you need more of it to support less actual news. So I believe that the blockchain and Bitcoin and Ether will allow micropayments, hassle-free payments all across the internet. And this is what Brendan Eich is also engineering, so that the link between the consumer of local news and the producer of local news is direct. He pays for his news to the news producer, and it doesn't get diverted out into some advertising intermediary and dissipated across the internet.
So we produced a story. We got a glimpse of this in the Rappahannock News. Every week we have one or two stories we think might have national interest. And we had a story on snakes, poisonous snakes, on the side of our mountain, and it went viral. And it was seen by, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, maybe a couple million people. And we thought, gee, this is lightning in a bottle. How do we get more of this?
Did you get compensated for any of those views?
That's where I'm going.
Yeah.
If we had a micropayment system, something that went viral would have actually hit our revenue stream.
That's right.
And that's
That's the point.
Look, I want to come back to where we are with the FCC, but I want to stick with micropayments for just a second, because that's pretty exciting. How does that work? How micro are micropayments? If I pick up a paper, if I'm looking at my screen and it says I want to read the story on snakes, what happens?
When you click on it, their formula, Brendan Eich has a formula whereby the first click is worth a penny or a few pennies, and if you and then there's a convex curve that you keep paying to read to the end of the story, and they're very. The total payment might be a dime.
That's my point. It's a very small number.
Yeah.
So as somebody
which is impossible to do on credit cards and the existing.
The transaction costs are enormous.
Right. Yeah. So this is why having Bitcoin as an internet currency eliminates all these costs of trusted third parties and credit card companies and security programs that give away millions of your credit card numbers.
I have to ask. I had a show in venture capital last week. How do I invest in these technologies?
You buy. You scrutinize these companies.
Okay.
There are 1,000 of them, and they all have interesting business propositions. And you buy their tokens. Or if you want to just bet in general on those 1,000 companies, you can buy Bitcoin or Ether. And And Bitcoin is on the path to be the new gold, so it could indeed continue to appreciate a lot in the future.
Well, before I end the show, to go call my broker, I'm joking, George. Let's come back to the FCC and where we are with changing the local ownership rules. Is that something that they can do, or does it require congressional action?
Fortunately, it's something the commission can do on its own
And
with
they're likely
a
to do
single
it.
vote. Yeah, likely to do next week.
And when that happens, what changes occur?
You know, it's not clear what changes are going to be noticeable. The point of this is to give these entrepreneurs in publishing and local news gathering the freedom to experiment and to, survive the transition period that they're in while they wait to supplement advertising and circulation with new sources of revenue like micropayments. And so the results may not be hugely noticeable. We're not sure yet. What we have seen is Jeff Bezos from Amazon rescued the Washington Post. That was wonderful. aside from him, some of the most likely potential investors would be other players in local news, and that's pretty much broadcasting.
And you mentioned ideological opposition. Who's opposed to this and why?
You know, principally the opposition is from the Democratic Party on this, although it's not exclusively. But I would just point out that during the previous administration, during the National Broadband Plan in 2010, the previous administration expressed great concern, cited enormous job losses in newsrooms that were occurring at that time. Some of the proposals that were actually considered were direct subsidy from taxpayer revenues, or relaxing our country's copyright laws, which protect
Gee,
inventors.
those are really bad ideas.
Those are bad ideas. Those are
I
bad
mean,
ideas.
what
subsidy.
is Reagan's
Well,
saying?
yeah, Reagan, what's the government's view of the economy? If it moves, tax it. If it continues moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it.
Well, thanks, guys. This has been a great show. I'm glad to have
that's
you
a-
on. And George, final word?
Yeah, that was a great. I can't
Okay,
beat that
can't
final
top it.
word. Quote the great man Ronnie. For
Well, George and Hans, thank you. See you again soon.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks.
Appreciate it so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thanks for joining us on Common Ground.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe to Common Ground with Bill Walton on iTunes.